Welcome, Job, to my YouTube channel. Job and I met through Facebook, and he really wanted to share his story, and I loved his energy, and I just wanted to invite him on my channel. And I was just commenting on his name. I'm like, Job, what a cool name. I don't know if I've ever met anyone named Job. So, and you said you're an elder's son. So if you
Yeah,
can just go into your story and talk to us about how the
absolutely.
Jehovah's Witnesses came into your life and your story as a Jehovah's Witness and how you left. I'll just take it from there.
Absolutely. So I was born in and raised by two Jehovah's Witnesses. My dad actually had become an elder in the early 1980s. He had learned about the organization back in the 70s during the Vietnam War. I think he was about 15 years old, and he was raised Catholic, as most Hispanics in Texas are. And he had a lot of feelings towards the Vietnam War. And I think as a very young man, as a 15-year-old, he felt like the war was meaningless. So he had a lot of personal feelings that revolved around being a conscientious objector, and he didn't get a lot of satisfaction from the answers that he got from the Catholic Church. And so when the Jehovah's Witnesses came knocking, they had actually initially invited his brother, my uncle, to go to a meeting, and by proxy, my father was invited. When he went, he was impressed by not just the overall decision by the young men in the congregation who were going to turn 18 and become, you know, mandatory drafted at the time as it was for the war, that they all were unanimous in their decision to become conscientious objectors. And that really resonated with his personal beliefs. Also, seeing how during the meetings people would have their Bibles open, whereas growing up in the Catholic Church, you never really cracked open a Bible. It was on very special occasions. So he was very persuaded by this scholastic and also deeply ethical aspect of the Jehovah's Witnesses. My mom learned about the Jehovah's Witnesses a few years shortly after my father did, from her mother, who was called on by some pioneers. They're both originally from El Paso, Texas, so they both came into the organization in their own way. And later, as they both became baptized members, they found each other, they got married, and then they moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I was born. I'm the youngest of four kids. My oldest brother is actually a former Bethalite. He was in the farm, also known as Walk Hill, for about 14 years. He had some intermittent assignments both in Brooklyn as well as Patterson, but for the most part, he was in Walk Hill, assigned to different congregations. His last one was actually in Patterson, New Jersey. So, um, two sisters. One of them was a regular pioneer for several years. My mom was in and out of regular pioneering for several years. So you could say there was a lot of pressure as a child growing up with that theocratic legacy, if you will, of an elder father, a Bethlite brother, a pioneer sister, and mother. It's a lot of pressure for a young person, especially when there's this inner voice that says that you're different. And for me, that inner voice, for as long as I could remember, was that I am gay, which is a very unique position to find yourself in, especially in a fundamentalist Christian group such as Jehovah's Witnesses, where even now you see the homophobic agenda is getting worse. I think they're doubling down on it because they see how accepting everybody else is, not just in secular circles, but also in religious circles. Um, so that's that's kind of like the foundation for where I was in my spiritual quest as a Jehovah's Witness, but also my inner turmoil as a gay person. Um, yeah,
I must ask, how old were you when you feel you knew? And what kind of who did you tell at that time? And when was your first experience?
yeah. I
And
mean,
and then too, like another question I wanted to ask, like how old were you when you got baptized?
yeah, those are really good questions. For me, I just always knew. For a lot of people, there's this particular age. I want to say I was as young as 3 or 4 or 5, but I just always knew. Just like how any other person who's heterosexual just knows that they have an affinity towards the opposite sex. I just felt an affinity towards the same sex. However, I didn't actually verbalize that until I was about 18 years old. I was baptized at 16, which is kind of late for an elder kid.
Yeah, so I was
Uh,
gonna ask, so you were baptized at 16. At this point, you really knew that you were gay, and no one knew,
yeah,
I take it. And
correct, correct.
did you have any experiences in high school that you had, or I mean, you got baptized at 16, so I can.
That's a really good question. So it's one of those things where I think that because of the pressure of such a strong theocratic legacy, especially the fear of both the religion and the fear of my father. He's a man that tries to, I suppose, go through life both as an elder and as a father through means of fear. And so that was actually very instrumental in my growing up, and actually my psychology is feeling that love is the same thing as fear. And so because of that fear, there was a lot of inhibition to actually talk about those feelings until I actually acted out on them. I was 18 years old. I had an experience. I told my parents about it, and that was the first time I actually ever spoke about that in the context that this is who I am. I think previously there was some, revelations to my dad because, as who he wanted to study the publications with me. What does the Bible really teach? And inevitably, he was my teacher that led me to baptism. So there was some discussions about my proclivities, and as parents do, and as elders do, and as Bible student, your teachers do, they become very involved in your personal life as well as what you do. That's not very that's kind of frowned upon, when it comes to
So I'm gonna interrupt you for a second. I'm curious. So you got baptized when you were 16. You didn't come out until you were
mhm.
18. What was the situation at home like for you then to get baptized when you were 16? Was there pressure from your mom or your brother, your
Yeah,
sister, people in the congregation? And then how did you feel after knowing your situation? And I know you said your dad was much more of a fear-driven person, which I totally understand. I hear that a lot from
yeah.
people who grew up with elders as fathers. It's like you are afraid of
Mhm.
Jehovah, and then you're afraid of your dad, and yeah, it's
Yeah.
just like a life of fear. So if you can explain like what led you up to your baptism, and then what was like your home life after, because you obviously knew that things were gonna be changing and shifting. So if you can just talk about that for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the home life, I remember when I was 12 or 13 years old and having a very, very direct conversation with my mom. My siblings, most of them had gotten baptized at a very early age. My brother was 10. My sister was at that time, or at the time she got baptized was 12. I was 12 years old, and I was sort of dragging my feet when it came to wanting to get baptized or one going on the service, as most pubescent 12-year-olds would do. And I had a very direct conversation with my mother, which was she's very emphatic about this is the religion that we follow in this house. And if you want to leave this religion, it's your choice, but you can't live here. And it's a very, in retrospect, it's an emotionally abusive conversation to have with a 12-year-old, which is these are your options. You can join us, or you can be out in the street. Um, and I don't think that doesn't quite symbolize who my mother is as a person. Outside of that conversation, she's a very loving person. She really is to this day. However, fear is what drives her motivation. Fear is what asserts her love for her own children, and inevitably is what led to my shunning to this day. is her choosing her fear over and her loyalty to this religion over her innate sense of love and affection for her own family. So that just kind of personifies how childhood was. You know, there was a lot of fear by means of my father. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of fear that drives households who have that sort of theocratic background. And my dad wasn't just about the emotional fear of you'll disappoint Jehovah. He was also a man who used physical violence as a means to ensure that we adhered to that structure. And yeah, it's something that even years later, now I'm going to be 30 in a few days, I've had to learn through therapy how to unwind that, because abuse is not love. And abuse can come in several different forms. It's not just physical, it's psychological, it's emotional, and sometimes it comes from our own parents. So it's a story that, you know, my background is very similar to a lot of elders' kids, especially with the kids whose parents happen to come from really bad situations themselves. I think that my parents, you know, they were good parents outside of the organization, but the organization allowed them a sense of codependency that most fundamentalist groups do, that I think it took to extremes out of an abundance of caution and a strong desire to try to save their children. And it's led to a lot of emotional turmoil, both on their part and and myself as one of their kids. It's one of those things. It's a very complex psychology, but yeah, 16 when I got baptized, and then 18 years old when I finally told my parents that I was gay, in very direct terms, that I had this experience. And it was one of those moments in my life where I was absolutely shamed by my dad, absolutely guilted. The conversation more or less went, when I confessed to what I had done, went with him just wailing on me on the fact that he was going to have to step down as being an elder, the fact that they were going to have to leave their pioneering behind. They were 2 weeks away from pioneer school, and they were not going to be allowed to go to pioneer school. I was going to get this fellowship. I was going to have to move out. 18 years old, which is very traumatizing to anybody, especially a teenager, especially a child at that time, for all intents and purposes. And none of that happened. I didn't get this fellowship. I got publicly reproved. He didn't step down as an elder. He didn't have to. He didn't get asked to. He still went to pioneer school. I think that is very revealing in my father's inner fear of losing everything that he's obtained in terms of prominence, and how that came at centerfold for him as opposed to the well-being of his child. And I think it's very emblematic for how my parents operate themselves as both parents, as Jehovah's Witnesses, and as people. The organization comes first and foremost.
And I am so curious, after all of that happened, you told your dad and he said all of those things. You said none of that happened. You got publicly reproved. So then take me into that time in your life at 18 years old when that happened to you. What happened after that? Because you said you're going to be 30 soon. So that was 12,
Yeah.
almost 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Walk us back to like that time in your life when you were getting out of had you graduated from high school at that time, or were you about to graduate high school?
I just finished high school. It was a couple of months after I just finished high school, and the plan was actually to go to school to pursue my degree in nursing. And my father had a very frank conversation that same night that I had told him what I had done, and having that same-sex experience, he felt that going to nursing school was going to add to my femininity or to my same-sex attraction in some shape or form. And he convinced me to actually leave that career path behind and follow his, which is air conditioning. It's a very blue collar, field, and I think he felt that if I pursued that, it would help. And it didn't. It really didn't. If anything, I much enjoyed being around all those hardworking, laboring men in my class, as opposed to going to a nursing school full of mostly women. So, but I pursued it. I pursued it for a few years. I left my dreams behind. I didn't go to a university. I ended up going to a community college and pursuing a certificate in air conditioning science. And I tried. Um, it became very locked down soon after I had that conversation with my friends and was reproved. My friend circle got a lot smaller. When you're an elder's kid and you get reproved publicly, you lose a lot of respect from the community. You lose a lot of, and you end up losing a lot of friends. There's a lot of judgment for somebody who repents, because at the end of the day, they sinned anyways. And that was very difficult. I don't think my stance in the organization or my reputation ever really recovered from that, because I showed to a lot of people that I was human, and that just wasn't good enough.
I'm curious. So you got publicly reproved. Did the people in congregation know why you got publicly reproved?
There was a lot of talks. You know, the elders are the insidious part about going to a judicial committee is that you only talk about the circumstances to 3 or 4 elders that are part of the investigation, and then at the end result, you know, the judicial committee, and they're not supposed to talk to other members of the congregation or other members of the elder body about what had happened. But I think because it had to do with homosexuality, and I was in a Spanish-speaking congregation at the time, where the homophobia is a bit more, shall I say, it's worse. Culturally, it's not as accepted as most North American cultures. There was a lot of behind the doors, behind the scenes revelations about my past to other members of the body, and I think even other members of the congregation. So, you know, there were talks, there were whispers about why I had gotten reproved, and some people speculated it involved another sister, which I kind of rode those coattails. I was like, yeah, go with that. But I think not just only did my reputation not recover in the congregation, it hindered even more so my relationship with my father. Up until that point, I had a sister who was disfellowshipped, along with her boyfriend at the time. They're now married and still active in the congregation. I think my father had a lot of pressure for me not to follow in that same sort of direction. She was the sister that could do no wrong. She was a regular pioneer. She had these aspirations to go to Bethel to work as a nurse, and the downfall, the disgrace per my dad was intolerable, and he didn't want me to do that same thing, and I did, and it was very egregious to him, that I had fallen off the path of grace. So I think when it comes to, like we were talking about, the aftermath of being publicly reproved, on a family basis, it was difficult. On a social basis, it was difficult. But I embodied myself to be better and to not act on it. And I refrained for a good 5 years. And in those 5 years, I joined the workforce per my dad's recommendations. Ended up going into business with him. He started his own family business of air conditioning that he still has to this day. That he shares with my brother, who's the eldest. And I tried. At the same time that I was going to college full time, I and working part time with my dad, I was regular pioneering. Part of it was just to try to prove to my parents that I had reformed, and to prove to the greater community of Jehovah's Witnesses that I had reformed. I ended up getting shingles my second month of pioneering. I had gone to the doctor, I remember, and I had this bad breakout of shingles, and the doctor sat me down and he said, we don't see this in 20-year-olds. This has to happen when somebody's in a very high stress environment. So he said, what's going on at home? And in my perception, everything was perfect. I was a regular pioneer. I was doing right. I was reforming. I was going to school to study the career that my father wanted me to. I didn't understand what could be wrong. But at the time, with all those stressors, I was also coming to a revelation that I no longer believed in the organization. And I had doubts about my beliefs, my Christian beliefs, since I was in high school. But I
But
shelved them, as most people do.
I was going to say, but let's be honest, Joe, because there's two books that are really amazing, When the Body Says No and When the Body Keeps the Score. But your body was
Absolutely
speaking to you in a
yeah.
way that you didn't have the courage to speak to yourself. So the shingles was like, hello, you are not living your authentic life. In fact, you are living like 1% of what your life
Absolutely.
can be. And you were
Absolutely.
just like you said, you completely shut that part of yourself away to win that attachment to your parents, which is totally normal. And so you went to the doctor. How old were you when you got diagnosed with shingles?
20.
20. What a
Years
young
old.
age.
Too young.
And describe to people, like, what are the effects of shingles? What were you experiencing?
So I actually ended up getting a very rare form of ocular shingles. So they actually attacked my eyes, and it it hurt. I never had a pain as horrible as that. For me, it felt like there was a needle in both of my eyes, and that lasted for a few days. Um, at that time, there wasn't really a lot of medication. There was a clinical trial that the doctor had been privy to, the optometrist, I should say, and she actually used that as a means of trying to accelerate the healing process. But she said, this is just something you kind of have to wait out. And it I just remember being at school when it first started. I was at air conditioning school. I was looking at the board and thinking, hey, it kind of looks a little fuzzy. And I just complained to my mom about it. And then eventually I just felt like maybe I might have cut my cornea with putting in my contacts one morning or something, because it was starting to hurt. Gradually, that pain just became very unbearable, to the point where in between visits to the optometrist, I just laid on the couch because I couldn't do anything. I couldn't, if I opened my eyes, it hurt. If I closed them, it still hurt, but it wasn't as bad. Um, it was, and you're absolutely right. The body was telling me something. It was screaming, this is not who you are. This is not what you love. This is not what you want to do. And it was a wake-up call that I slowly but surely started to listen to. As I got better and recovered from the shingle outbreak, I decided that I had to stop pioneering. Um, and so did the elder body. They had a discussion with me. I was very honest about the hours that I put in for my field service time report. Come to find, almost nobody did. Now, almost nobody was very honest about that. I should have lied my way through it, but honestly, if I had, I think I would have stayed in the organization much longer if I was dishonest about a lot of things that I was very honest about. And before I could go to Pioneer School, they had a discussion with me, and I just felt bad about going to Pioneer School and not being able to actually make the hours. Despite probably most people who would go to Pioneer School don't actually make the hours. And so on an ethical aspect, on a moral aspect, I decided not to go because I felt like I didn't deserve it. That's just kind of the person who I am. And um, so I think 6 months after the ocular shingles outbreak, I was in my dad's shop in the back of our house in Albuquerque, and he said something to me. He said, "You don't really like this, do you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I think if you find something you like and you want to pursue it, you should do it." And that was kind of the permission I needed at the time to actually pursue something different. So I didn't go back to nursing school. What I did was I pursued pharmacy technology. at the same community college where I went to get my air conditioning certificate and studies. It was a short, brief program, and I finished when I was 22. So it took about a year and a half from that point of getting shingles to actually finish school and then actually get hired on at the first hospital that I interned at. And that actually provided some financial stability for me to actually step out of my parents' home in terms of a living situation, which was also, I got a little bit of a push from my dad. I always knew that up until that point that I still had these feelings about same-sex attraction. I just was still very fearful about acting on them while still living with my parents. I thought that would push me over the edge if I still live with them, because inevitably I would revert back to that child of an 18-year-old and tell them everything. And I didn't want that to happen. So I decided, but if that was something that I would do, it would be on my own terms in my own place. And so I remember having a conversation with a sister after the meeting who sat right behind us about how I was full-time employed now after I finished school and graduated from the community college with my certificate in pharmacy technology. And she said, well, so she joked and said, hey, so have you thought about moving out? Which is kind of a big no-no in the Hispanic community. You don't really move out until you get married, and even a while after that. And I had said, well, honestly, I've actually thought about it. And so she joked with my dad, who was standing just a few feet away. She said, hey, Joe's thinking about moving out. And he's like, well, good. If that's what he wants to do, he can do it. And it was kind of a arm's distance remark, which is very atypical for my dad. And I thought, you know what? I will. And so that night I had texted my aunt, who is an inactive member of the organization. She's mentally out, physically out. And I asked her if any of her properties that she manages was available. And she said, yeah, there's actually a studio. We just put it on the market a few days ago. And she's like, wow, this is pretty cool that you're asking me about it now. Are you interested? And I said, yes. And that inevitably led to me moving out of my parents' house, which caused them a lot of turmoil, I think, for both my father and my mother, and my brother, who had just moved back from Bethel and was living with us, which felt like having a third parental figure. They were very worried that I was going to leave the organization. They were very fearful. I'd stopped commenting as much. I'd stopped going on service as much at that time. And they could see the writing on the wall. And it was still something I wanted to do. I gave them the assurances that I thought was appropriate for them to hear at the time. We would have these family study meetings in which we discussed my spiritual weakness prior to moving out, and very candid conversations with the three of them that in retrospect were very inappropriate to have about how they were annoyed and concerned that I was moving out now, considering I wasn't very spiritually strong. And it didn't deter me. It's still something I wanted to do. Moving out was a very interesting process. I feel like in most normal, healthy family contexts, when a child moves out of the home, there's a lot of support. I remember the day that I moved out. I didn't see my parents. I didn't see my brother. They didn't come out of their rooms. I had some friends from the congregation help me move my boxes and my stuff. I didn't get any physical or financial support from my parents whatsoever. Emotionally, I mean, as discussed, they were very much opposed. There was they did not condone me moving out whatsoever. When I moved out a few months into being on my own, I gave myself the permission to challenge both my beliefs and my stringency when it came to my sexuality. And I tried again. I tried another experience. Psychologically, I was still at a place where I felt very tied to the organization. So that meant that experience led to a lot of guilt. For a lot of witnesses, especially ones that grow up in a very fearful stronghold of seeing the world and seeing their spirituality, the guilt was insurmountable to the point that I thought about self-harming. I thought that if Jehovah was a God of justice, that the best course of action for my sins was to go above and beyond and follow suit with how Jehovah saw homosexuals in the Old Testament. And I thought, well, maybe it's best to end my life. I think that point was the greatest wake-up call in my life. I had reached out to a suicide hotline here in the States, which I've never done before. And the embrace that I got from the person on that phone call saved my life. But it also paved a road to understanding these beliefs that I have are causing this cognitive dissonance to the point where I want to end my own existence, and that's not okay. There should be no religion, there should be no orthodoxy, there should be no creed, no belief system that wants to make you end your life because you don't feel worthy. And it took a long time for me to get to that point and full circle realization of that. But I took steps to see a therapist, put myself in a lot of debt. Pretty sure I put her kids through college. It was 6 years of therapy on a weekly basis, sometimes on a every other week, twice a month basis, because that's all I could afford. But I made it work. It was my priority to make it work. It was a lot of financial burden, but I made it work, and I'm so glad that I did that. When I was about 6 months into therapy, I decided to join the dating scene and the gay community, and I met someone. At this time, up until then, I had been going to the meetings on and off, but I made a decision in September of 2017 to stop going to meetings. And part of that was because we had a Watchtower study on how in the Israelite times, Jehovah had used stoning as a means of justice. And I went home and I watched this show, and you might be familiar with it in Sweden, or anybody watching. It's called Handmaid's Tale. And there's a particular scene in this first season, towards the end of the first season, where they have a stoning ceremony where they're supposed to stone someone for kidnapping and child endangerment. And they decide not to. They put their lives at risk and decide not to. And it was so evocative because it showed this higher sense of morality, this higher sense of ethics, this higher sense of love, of not wanting to stone their sister, their friend, who obviously has some mental health issues in the show. And I remember thinking, they bestow this kindness to this person, and I'm supposed to believe after this Watchtower study that Jehovah is kind and a God of just, based off this perception that stoning was a loving arrangement. No, I'm not going to go back. So flash forward to about 6 months later, I met someone. We started dating. We started going out. It's my first relationship, so I was very excited, very new, not only just to dating a man, but also having experiences of being a worldly person, celebrating my birthday and it's Valentine's Day, and just feeling overjoyed by these nuances in life that behaving as a non-witness gives you the permission to do. And I was excited. And then 4 months after we started dating, it was 6 months after we had started dating, it was very quick, very sudden. He asked me to move in, and I said, okay, but I have to tell my mom. I have to tell my mom. I didn't really care too much to tell my dad because I knew exactly what his response would be. And my therapist and I had been going back and forth about what the conversation or the aftermath would look like with my mother. And so after several attempts of trying to meet her in person, I finally called her one day at work and I said, Mom, there's something I have to tell you. You're not going to like it, but I need you to know. And to that point, I bumped into a lot of witnesses at grocery stores or restaurants while I was with my boyfriend. And I thought, she probably knows, but she needs to hear it from me directly. So I told my mom, I'm gay and I have a boyfriend and I'm going to be living with him. And you've got to be okay with that. It was a very interesting conversation because I think the shock of it really, really, not just the shock. I think looking back at it now, her humanity as both a mother and as a human, as a person, started to rise. And she started off by saying, you know, you're an adult. These are your decisions. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But as soon as she said that, I think it caught up to her the fear that her life has been based on. And it pulled her down. And the conversation made a left turn. And she said, but I love my God and I love my beliefs more than I love my own children. And if this is a path that you want to pursue, this is the last conversation we're ever going to have. So we went back and forth about how she said that I needed to leave this life behind, how I needed to confess to the elders. And up to that point, her and I had separate conversations about me saying, I no longer believe that Jehovah's Witnesses have the truth. And, you know, I'd read up on 1914, 607 BCE, and I said, none of it makes sense. None of it makes sense. So, you know, obviously it was because she felt like she was threatened and she was losing a stronghold on her child who was going down the path of sin, that she was trying to pull at these things of, you know, you need to repent, you need to tell the elders what you did, as a kind of a final attempt to try to convince me to stay in the organization. And it wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work. I'd been in therapy for over a year at that point and said, no, I'm not going to go back. I'm not going to tell the elders what I did because what I'm doing, I don't believe is wrong. I'm an adult. And she said, well, you know what this means then. We cannot have the same conversation anymore going forth. And she started to cry and she said, I just want you to know that I love you. And then she hung up. And that was the last time I heard from her. That was in July of 2018.
Wow. What a way to tell a parent. I'm glad that you had the courage to tell her to her face. And it sounds like it went as good as it possibly could be.
It did.
Unfortunately, I know it sounds crazy to maybe like somebody who's on the outside, but I totally understand. And at this point, did she then escalate it to your father? And I'm curious as to then did you get privately reproved or did you get publicly reproved or did you disassociate yourself or what was the after effect of that as well?
That's a good question. I mean, the aftermath was kind of expected, actually. So my mom, obviously, she being the Jehovah's Witness elders wife that she is, she told my dad and my brother. I think they all still reside in the same home. My father or nor my brother actually had a conversation with me about it. They just quickly reverted to the shunning altogether, which I don't know. There's a part of me that feels that's very emblematic about um, how bad our relationship was, but also I think it's just I think they felt that me going to the extreme of not just being okay with my sexuality, but also moving in with a boyfriend they felt like there was very little that they could actually say to convince me otherwise, that I would just eventually have to acknowledge my sin and come back to the organization, because that's every Jehovah's Witness's wet dream about what happens when a person sins and leaves. And it's not what happened. So my father became aware of it, and soon after that, the rumors were confirmed. I remember going to a funeral for an elder's wife a few months after that had taken place. So that was in July. So that funeral was in October. I had so recently left the organization that, you know, phenotypically or visually, I still looked like a witness. I dressed in my, you know, usual Sunday best. I didn't have facial hair at the time. I looked like a Jehovah's Witness. But as soon as I walked into the funeral home where the funeral was held, I could tell that people were giving me a wide berth. People were keeping their distance. People whose weddings I had been in weren't saying hello. I think I got a greeting, you know, some greetings for a few people that were unbeknownst to everything that had happened. And I saw my parents. I saw my mother. And I remember she walked very close up to me and just stared at me. And I knew she really badly wanted to say hello. Very badly wanted to give me a hug. And she looked like the emotional toll of losing another child to the world was just, it was painted across her face. I didn't get summoned to the judicial committee. I don't think up until this point that I've been disfellowshipped and abstention. I think I've just faded out. So 6 to 9 months before I left the organization or stopped going to meetings, I decided to switch from the Spanish to the English congregation. I will say that comparatively between the Spanish and English congregations, there's a lot less of a crusade to try to hunt witnesses down in terms of laying all the cards on the table and saying about revealing their status as either a reproved witness or a disfellowship witness to the congregation. But that's not true across the board. I mean, I've heard some very horrible stories about folks in the English congregation, especially folks who come out publicly against the organization, who get hunted or pursued by elders and sent letters about judicial committees coming up. And honestly, if I currently live in Denver, I don't live in Albuquerque. If they were to send me a letter of summoning me to a judicial committee, they'd have to work very hard to actually find my address. But if they did, I think I'd go. I think I'd go on the sense of defending my own integrity. I've been in judicial committees before, and I've seen how they have this sense of, we can ask anything. We have carte blanche to know everything about your personal life. And I'd love to have the opportunity to remind them that they don't, because I'm treacherous like that. But no, I've never been. I was not disfellowshipped. I was not reproved. But the infamy of who I was as a gay man, you know, just circled like a brush fire across the community. And then a year later, you know, in the aftermath of being shunned by my parents, by my brother, and my sister who's still active, I said, I'm not going to take this thing down. This is unnatural. This is unnatural for this to occur when your own family disowns you for your decisions to do something as a consenting adult in a loving relationship aspect. And my story is not unique to my circumstances. So I started a ex-Jehovah's Witness group in New Mexico, in Albuquerque. Incidentally, at the time that I left the organization in 2017, 2018, a lot of other people were leaving as well. And I reached out. I became the administrator of a group. We held meetups, we held just rendezvous, and it was amazing. It was so healing. It was so cathartic to talk to other witnesses about the injustice of not just being shunned, but set up for failure by the organization, having these unrealistic expectations for your humanity. That was kind of the nail in the coffin in terms of my parents reaching out to me or having any semblance of relationship with me, because it was apostasy. A lot of witnesses, current witnesses, who just weren't ready to leave the organization, I tried reaching out to, who were disfellowshipped, but still very much mentally in, reported the group to several different bodies of elders, and I was labeled as an apostate. So it quickly turned from, you know, a gay person, a former gay witness that you would see at the grocery store, and sometimes I'd get a nod or a handshake from some witnesses who were concerned. It was in this fellowship, so they could still talk to me. To witnesses then seeing me at the grocery store and turning their way and leaving. There's a lot of fear when it comes to being recognized as an apostate.
I hear you loud and clear. I know exactly the situation that you're in. So you moved to Denver. What brought
Yeah,
you to Denver after you were living in Albuquerque?
Albuquerque, yeah, Albuquerque, Mexico.
So what brought you to Denver? And was it your partner that you're still living with, or is there a job that brought you there?
Yes, well, a little bit of A, a little bit of B. And this kind of comes full circle to my story and where I'm at now. I'd met somebody while I was in Albuquerque, who eventually became the second relationship I've had, a long-term relationship I had. The first one ended. I moved out. I still continued to live in Albuquerque. And before I had moved out, when it was already over with this first gentleman, I met someone else, and he had a story very similar to mine of living in the shadows, in terms of his sexuality, and we bonded over that. I felt a lot of similarities between him and I, both emotionally, emotionally and mentally, when it came to living in fear. So we eventually became a couple in 2021, end of 2021. He moved out to Denver in July of 2021, and I'm trying to think back to 2021. Yes, July of 2021. And so by the time we became a couple in November of 2021, we had just talked about, you know, what it would look like having a living arrangement together. I got a new job in Albuquerque in March of 2022, which allowed me actually transferability after that facility closed down, that pharmacy facility closed down, for me to transfer over to Denver. So it kind of all worked out. So by July of 2022, I was living here in Denver with my then partner. It's such an interesting story because I feel like the romantic relationships that I established after leaving the organization follow the very same structure of being in that religion, but in the context of a relationship, where I've given my personal power, my meaning, and my authority to someone else. Outsourcing it to somebody else is so much easier because you feel less responsible for self. It took a few months of living with this person, with this man, before the relationship became abusive, became controlling, and eventually became violent. It was a very interesting situation. The authorities got involved at my request. He was arrested. And it was very interesting because the friends that we both had made here, they took a side. They were upset that I had called the police, despite this not being the first time he ever laid hands on me. He fed them a narrative that absolutely blackmailed my reputation with our friends. And I felt shunned again. This all happened in December, actually, December 18th. So it was very recent. And I had to have a very hard look at myself and realize that I have a pattern. I have a pattern of establishing relationships with people that are very much follow the same structure as the religion I left behind. Where I outsource my meaning to someone else in order to feel like I have personal value. And I did that with the organization. I had a community of friends by means of him that came with strings attached. In the organization, the strings attached are you can be our friends as long as you stay a witness. And in the context of this relationship, you can stay friends as long as you're with Bill. Breaking the bondage of those relationship patterns is very difficult because you have to allow other people to do that. In no way, shape, or form am I responsible for the man that he is, or am I responsible for the physical violence. But there is a way to end those things, and it's by saying no, and it's by stopping those relationships. I am by no way, shape, or form bound to anybody or anything anymore because I'm an adult and I'm a human being. I had mentioned before that abuse is not love, love is not abuse. And it rings true not just for religion, but also for a relationship. I went back into therapy, and the second therapist was amazing, just as much as the first one, but in his own way. It helped me to realize that there were issues stemming from my upbringing in the religion that were bleeding into my relationships because they were unresolved. And yeah, I was taken aback because I felt like I had put this behind me. But healing is not an event. It's a process. It's a process that takes a lifetime. And that is my greatest ambition in life, is to continue to heal and to tell other people or to share with other people that it takes a lifetime, but it's so worth it. I got my own place. I have housemates now, which is different, but it's safe. I'm learning who I am for the first time, and I feel like I'm giving myself permission to do so for the first time since leaving the organization, because I always had a safety net. I always had a security at some sense, at some level, by being in a relationship. And I would just encourage witnesses who leave for the first time to find out who they are. It's very easy to distract yourself by means of another person, but you eventually have to face the music and realize that that the most important person that exists is you. You have to give yourself that meaning. You have to give yourself the time to find your story and find what is okay and is not okay. You never tolerate abuse from anybody or any organization.
Wow, Job, thank you so much for sharing. First, I wanted to commend you on the exJW Witness group that you put together. That in and of itself shows that you're a leader and that you're willing to kind of make yourself uncomfortable to bring people together for the greater good of not just yourself, but a community that understands. And as ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, we speak our own languages and know what it feels like to be in that situation where, like you said, you give yourself away and you're living for someone else, not even in your own body, and just that whole situation. And I also want to add to that, I commend you again on taking the initiative and going to therapy for as long as you have, more than 6 years. And like you said, you went into a lot of debt, which a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses really need to pursue, but they really just sometimes don't even feel like they need it, which is really unfortunate. So I really commend you on that.
Thank you.
And as you were saying, this is the first time you're really living for yourself, which as you said too, it's so easy to fall into a relationship and just kind of give ownership of yourself to somebody else and just say, you know what, I've lived not the best life, and I'm just going to allow this
Yeah,
person to help me. They're going to be my knight in shining armor, and they're going to save me, and they're
absolutely.
going to do
My
all the
savior.
things that, yeah, they're going to do all the things that I need for them to do to help me feel better. Whereas, like, you need to figure yourself out. So, I commend you so much on that, and
Thank you.
I just love I feel like you're in such a great place right now. And as you said, you're finally at a place right now where you're just discovering yourself and having housemates where you can just be yourself, be your silly self and
Yeah,
not really care about like what my partner thinks about me. Am I doing something right? And then not the organization and not my parents and not my siblings. Like there's no one to kind of feel like you need to be something else to win their love and approval. Now you can just be yourself,
absolutely.
which is a whole new
Absolutely.
thing for you. I'm so
We all
happy for
deserve it.
you, Job.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I also love how you kind of ended this with saying that healing is not it's not linear and it's not there's not a end goal. And sometimes when you think you heal something, you can get triggered again. It's very deceiving because you're like,
Yeah.
I thought I worked through this, but it's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
not how it works. And
No.
you have to find the root cause of all that stuff. And I'm so happy that your new therapist is really bringing back to that childhood self and understanding with the how the religion played a key role in how that affected your relationship with who you are right now. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you so much for this interview, Job. I
You're
think that there's
welcome.
so many different parts about this interview that people are going to really resonate with. So I appreciate it so much. And is there anything you'd like to add before we end this video?
There's a quote by a Lebanese American poet that I live by up, up to and through this day. He says, "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy it can contain." We, as former witnesses, experience a great deal of loss, whether it's familial or through friends or through the lives that we had with a greater sense of community, and all of that can be regained. More so in the fact that we are so used to having conditional love that the tides change when we realize that we are deserving of unconditional love. And that can be found. That can be found with so many people out there in the world, which is not as scary of a place as they said it would be. There's a lot of beauty. There's a lot of beautiful faces of people who will love you unconditionally for everything and anything that you are, and everything and anything that you are not. And it is just beyond. Keep going. Don't give up.
I I couldn't agree with you more. Once you find your soul family, that unconditional love that you speak about washes over you and just cascades and washes over the life of the conditional love that you had as a Jehovah's Witness. And that also exceeds like the conditional love you had from your blood
Yeah, it
family
does.
as
It
well.
does.
It's
It really
just it's
does.
like, wow, this is what and I feel like unconditional love is so healing and it could be from
Absolutely.
anyone. So, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much again, Joe, for
Thank
this
you. Thank
absolutely
you.
amazing interview. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
watching this interview, and I'm gonna hit end.